The morning mist hung like a shroud over the Lancashire moorlands on November 15, 1892, clinging to the gnarled hawthorn hedgerows and rolling across the muddy cart tracks that snaked between isolated farms. Constable Thomas Whitfield pulled his woolen greatcoat tighter against the bitter wind as he guided his horse along the narrow lane toward Mortimer's pig farm. At 43, Whitfield had seen his share of unpleasant sights during his 20 years of rural policing, but nothing had prepared him for what awaited him in that God-forsaken corner of the moors. The complaint had come from Samuel Crowther, whose modest dairy farm sat half a mile to the east. "There's a stench coming from Mortimer's place," the old farmer had told Whitfield the previous evening, his weathered face creased with worry. "Been going on for near a week now. And the sounds at night. Dear God, Constable, the sounds." As Whitfield crested the small hill that overlooked the Mortimer property, the first thing that struck him was the silence. No smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney despite the November chill, and the usual sounds of morning farm activity were conspicuously absent. Instead, there was only the restless squealing of pigs and a low, unsettling growling that seemed to echo across the empty yard. The farmhouse itself was a modest stone structure, probably built in the 1820s with thick walls blackened by decades of soot and weather. Ivy crept up its northern face and several windows on the upper floor were boarded shut. The outbuildings, a barn, a chicken coop, and what appeared to be a root cellar, clustered around the main house like supplicants before an altar. But it was the pig enclosures that drew Whitfield's attention, and with it a creeping sense of dread. The smell hit him before he reached the gate. It wasn't the typical farmyard odor of manure and hay that any countryman would recognize. This was something far more sinister, sweet and putrid with an underlying metallic tang that made his stomach clench. He had smelled death before, but this was different. Older. More deliberate. Whitfield dismounted and approached the nearest pig pen with growing unease. The animals within were unlike any farm pigs he had ever seen. They were enormous, their pink flesh mottled and their eyes holding an intelligence that seemed almost predatory. As he drew closer, they pressed against the wooden rails with an eagerness that was deeply unsettling, their snouts quivering and their small eyes fixed upon him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. It was then that he saw the bones. Scattered throughout the mud of the pig enclosure were fragments that gleamed white in the gray morning light. At first glance, they appeared to be the remnants of the animals feeding, nothing unusual for a pig farm. But as Whitfield's trained eye examined them more closely, his blood ran cold. The shape was wrong. The size was wrong. And there, half buried in the churned earth, was something that made his heart hammer against his ribs, a human jawbone. 3 teeth still clinging to the yellowed bone lay among the pig droppings like a discarded toy. With trembling hands, Whitfield pushed open the gate and stepped into the enclosure. The pigs pressed closer, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. As he bent to examine the bone more closely, his boot struck something hard. He looked down to see a tarnished silver ring, its band twisted and scratched, nestled against what appeared to be a fragment of human skull. The constable's training took over, suppressing the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. He began a systematic examination of the area, his horror mounting with each discovery. Here, a piece of cloth that might once have been part of a dress. There, a brass button from a working man's jacket. And everywhere, scattered like some macabre feast, the unmistakable remains of human beings. A sound from behind made him wheel around, his hand instinctively moving to his truncheon. But the farmyard remained empty save for the restless pigs and a murder of crows that had gathered on the barn roof, watching the proceedings with black, intelligent eyes. Where was Caleb Mortimer? Whitfield made his way toward the farmhouse, noting the signs of recent habitation wheel ruts in the mud. Chicken feathers scattered about, a water bucket that still held a thin layer of ice from the previous night's frost. But the door hung slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges with each gust of wind, and no one answered his repeated calls. Inside, the house told a story of a hasty departure. Personal belongings lay scattered about clothing, papers, eating utensils, as if someone had gathered what they could carry and fled in the night. In the kitchen, Whitfield discovered something that made his blood run even colder. A wooden chopping block, its surface stained dark with what could only be blood. And beside it, a collection of butchering knives arranged with the precision of a surgeon's instruments. But it was in the root cellar that Whitfield made the discovery that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The heavy wooden door required considerable effort to open, and when it finally gave way, the smell that emerged was so overwhelming that he staggered backward, gasping for fresh air. When he finally managed to descend the stone steps with a lantern held high, the light revealed a chamber that defied comprehension. Hooks hung from the ceiling beams, some still bearing remnants of flesh. Wooden tables lined the walls, their surfaces scarred and stained. And in the corner, arranged with meticulous care, were personal belongings that spoke of lives cut short: a woman's handkerchief, a man's pocket watch, a child's wooden toy horse. As the full horror of his discovery settled upon him, Constable Whitfield understood that he had stumbled upon something unprecedented in the annals of British crime. This was not a simple murder, nor even a series of murders. This was something far more sinister. A systematic operation that spoke of a mind so twisted, so utterly divorced from human decency, that it challenged his very understanding of what it meant to be human. With shaking hands, he climbed back into the gray morning light and made his way to the village telegraph office. His message to Scotland Yard was brief but urgent. Send detectives immediately. Have discovered evidence of unspeakable crimes. Multiple victims suspected. Mortimer's pig farm, Thornwick Parish. Matter of utmost gravity. As he waited for reinforcements to arrive, Constable Whitfield stood guard over that cursed farmyard, watching the pigs root through the mud for whatever morsels remained of their unholy feast. He could not have known that he had just uncovered one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in British history, or that the name Caleb Mortimer would soon strike terror into the hearts of people across the empire. The only question that remained was, where had the monster gone? This is to understand how such monstrous crimes could unfold undetected for nearly 3 years. One must first understand the England of the 1890s. A nation caught between the promise of industrial progress and the harsh realities of economic upheaval. Lancashire, in particular, bore the scars of this transformation more deeply than perhaps any other county. The great cotton mills that had once been the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution were faltering. Foreign competition, changing trade patterns, and economic depression had shuttered factory after factory throughout the 1880s. Thousands of mill workers found themselves cast out onto roads that led nowhere, carrying their meager possessions and searching for work that simply didn't exist. Many drifted back to the countryside their grandparents had abandoned decades earlier, hoping to find sustenance in the soil their families had once tilled. It was into this world of displacement and desperation that men like Caleb Mortimer could disappear entirely, becoming ghosts haunting the margins of a society that had little time or inclination to notice their absence. The moorlands of northern Lancashire were particularly well suited to such invisibility. Vast expanses of heather and gorse broken only by stone walls and the occasional isolated farmstead, where a man could live for months without encountering another soul. Caleb Mortimer had been born in 1845 to tenant farmers who worked a small holding near the village of Whalley. His father, Benjamin Mortimer, was by all accounts a decent man who struggled against the agricultural depression that gripped the region throughout the 1870s. Poor harvests, falling grain prices, and competition from American wheat had driven countless farming families to ruin, and the Mortimers were among them. Young Caleb watched his father's slow descent into drink and despair as creditors circled like vultures. The family lost their farm when Caleb was 26, a blow from which his father never recovered. Benjamin Mortimer died in the poorhouse in Blackburn just 2 years later, and his wife followed him within the month, some said from a broken heart, though the death certificate listed consumption. With his parents dead and the family land sold to pay debts, Caleb drifted into the industrial towns, finding work where he could. For nearly 5 years he labored in the cotton mills of Blackburn and Preston, his lungs slowly filling with the fiber dust that would eventually claim so many of his generation. Those who worked alongside him during this period remembered him as a quiet, competent worker who kept to himself. He was neither well-liked nor particularly disliked, simply one of thousands of anonymous souls feeding the great machines of industry. But Caleb Mortimer possessed something that set him apart from his fellow workers: a small inheritance from his maternal grandfather, a sum of nearly £200 that had been held in trust until his 30th birthday. When that money came to him in 1875, it represented more wealth than most working men would see in a lifetime. It was enough to purchase land, to start over, to become someone new. The property he chose lay in one of the most isolated corners of Lancashire, 8 miles from the nearest railway station, and 3 miles from the village of Thornwick. The 40-acre holding had been abandoned for nearly a decade before Mortimer purchased it, and local farmers spoke of it as cursed ground where nothing would grow and livestock sickened without apparent cause. The asking price reflected these superstitions, and Mortimer acquired the property for less than half its assessed value. The farmhouse itself was solid enough, built of local stone with walls thick enough to withstand the fierce moorland winters. But the property's most valuable asset in Mortimer's eyes was its isolation. The nearest neighbor, Samuel Crowther, was half a mile away across difficult terrain, and the old Roman road that passed the farm saw perhaps one traveler per week during the busy season. For his first few years as a farmer, Mortimer appeared to be following a conventional path toward respectability. He raised sheep initially, as most of his neighbors did, and made occasional appearances at the Thornwick market to sell wool and mutton. Local shopkeepers remembered him as polite but distant, a man who conducted his business efficiently and without unnecessary conversation. It was Sarah Whitmore who first glimpsed the darkness that lay beneath Mortimer's carefully constructed facade. Sarah was the 18-year-old daughter of the village blacksmith, and in 1883, she had accepted Mortimer's surprising proposal of marriage. The courtship had been brief and formal, conducted largely through letters and chaperoned visits, but Sarah's family saw it as a fortunate match for a girl whose prospects were limited in their small community. The marriage lasted barely 6 months. Sarah returned to her father's house in the spring of 1884, pale and thin, her eyes holding a haunted quality that concerned everyone who knew her. She would never speak publicly about what had transpired at the farm, but her closest friends whispered of strange habits, of meat that tasted wrong, of sounds in the night that chilled her to the bone. Sarah left Thornwick within the year, bound for relatives in Liverpool, and she never returned. Her departure marked the beginning of Mortimer's complete withdrawal from village society. Where once he had made weekly appearances at market, now months would pass without anyone seeing him. His sheep began to disappear from the fields, presumably sold, though no one could recall him bringing livestock to market. It was around this time that Mortimer began raising pigs. The choice was unusual for the region, where sheep were far better suited to the moorland environment. But pigs offered certain advantages for a man seeking privacy. They required less land to graze, could be fed on scraps and waste, and their natural intelligence made them efficient at disposing of unwanted materials. The transformation of Mortimer's property reflected his changing circumstances. The sheep pens gave way to sturdy pig enclosures built with unusual attention to height and security. He expanded the root cellar beneath his house, installing additional storage space that seemed far too large for a single man's needs. Most tellingly, he began making mysterious nighttime trips to nearby towns, always returning before dawn with his cart laden with supplies, whose nature remained hidden beneath heavy canvas. By 1889, Caleb Mortimer had become something of a local legend, a hermit who lived alone on the cursed farm, emerging only when absolutely necessary to conduct business with the outside world. Parents used him as a cautionary tale to frighten disobedient children, and even grown men gave his property a wide berth when traveling the old Roman road after dark. What none of them realized was that their boogeyman stories contained more truth than they could possibly imagine. For it was in 1889 that the disappearances began, quietly at first involving only those whose absence might go unnoticed for weeks or months. Traveling workers seeking employment, itinerant peddlers carrying their wares from farm to farm, and the desperate souls cast adrift by industrial collapse who moved through the countryside like leaves before an autumn wind. Margaret Ashworth was among the first to vanish. A widow of 34 whose husband had died in a mining accident near Burnley, she had been reduced to seeking domestic work wherever she could find it. Local records show that she had inquired about several positions in the Thornwick area during the late summer of 1889, including one that may have been offered by a farmer seeking a housekeeper. James Fletcher disappeared the following spring, a skilled weaver who had lost his position when the Oswald Twistle mills closed. Fletcher was known to be traveling between towns in search of work. He was last seen by the landlord of the Thornwick Inn, who recalled him asking for directions to various farms in the area where temporary labor might be available. Samuel Hartley vanished in the autumn of 1890. A peddler who carried his inventory of household goods, patent medicines, and small luxuries from farm to farm throughout northern Lancashire, Hartley was known to carry his life savings, perhaps 30 or 40 pounds, sewn into his clothing. His disappearance was noted because his usual customers expected his seasonal visit, but his route covered such a wide area that pinpointing his last known location proved impossible. These were not the kind of disappearances that generated immediate concern or extensive investigation. In an age before modern communication, when people routinely traveled long distances in search of work, a missing person might simply have moved on to better prospects elsewhere. The local constabulary, consisting of just 3 men responsible for covering hundreds of square miles, had neither the resources nor the inclination to mount extensive searches for transient workers who had no permanent addresses and few lasting connections to the community. This was the world that Caleb Mortimer had learned to navigate with increasing confidence and skill. A world where the desperate and dispossessed moved like shadows through the landscape, seeking opportunity and finding only exploitation. A world where a man with property and apparent respectability could operate with virtual impunity, as long as he was careful about his choice of victims and discreet about his methods. But as Constable Whitfield would soon discover, even the most careful predator eventually makes mistakes, and when those mistakes finally came to light on that gray November morning in 1892, they would reveal crimes so horrific that they would shake the very foundations of rural English society. The question that haunted investigators as they began their grim work was not whether Caleb Mortimer was guilty of these unspeakable acts, but how many victims lay buried in the mud of his pig enclosures, and whether anyone would ever be able to identify them all. The journal that investigators discovered hidden beneath loose floorboards in Mortimer's bedroom would become one of the most chilling documents in the annals of British criminal history. Written in a crude cipher that took Scotland Yard cryptographers nearly 2 weeks to decode, its pages revealed the methodical mind of a predator who had transformed murder into a calculated business enterprise. The entries began in September 1889, just weeks after Margaret Ashworth's disappearance, though Mortimer never used his victims' real names. Instead, he referred to them by crude descriptors: the widow woman, the mill hand, the fat peddler, as if reducing them to their most basic characteristics somehow diminished their humanity in his own mind. From these disturbing records, investigators were able to piece together Mortimer's evolution from opportunistic killer to systematic predator. His first murder appears to have been almost accidental, or at least unpremeditated. Margaret Ashworth had indeed come to the farm seeking housekeeping work, as Mortimer had advertised in the Blackburn Telegraph. But what should have been a simple employment arrangement quickly turned sinister. According to his journal entries, Mortimer had been studying Margaret for several days, watching her work and noting her habits. She was, in his words, sturdy and well-fed, qualities that seemed to hold significance beyond mere physical description. The entry, dated September 23, 1889, marks the night of her murder with clinical detachment. The widow woman took ill after her supper. Laudanum works quick enough. She went peaceful-like. Good weight to her. The pigs were grateful. Laudanum, a tincture of opium commonly used for pain relief and sleep disorders, had become Mortimer's weapon of choice. Easy to obtain and virtually undetectable when mixed with food, it rendered his victims unconscious within minutes of consumption. In larger doses, it could prove fatal on its own, but Mortimer preferred to ensure death through more direct means while his victims were insensible. The basement chamber that Constable Whitfield had discovered told the story of what happened next. Heavy ropes attached to pulleys allowed Mortimer to move unconscious victims into position. The hooks hanging from the ceiling beams served their grisly purpose, enabling him to drain blood from his victims, a necessary step, as he had learned from his years of butchering livestock, to preserve the meat and prevent rapid spoilage. But Margaret Ashworth's murder was merely the beginning of Mortimer's descent into systematic horror. Her death had solved several problems for him. It eliminated a potential witness to his increasingly erratic behavior, provided food for his expanding pig operation, and yielded a modest sum from the sale of her few possessions. More importantly, it demonstrated that a person could vanish from his farm without generating any official inquiry. The success of this first murder appears to have awakened something monstrous in Mortimer's psyche. His journal entries from the following months reveal a man becoming increasingly obsessed with the mechanics of killing and disposal. He experimented with different doses of laudanum, tested various methods of restraint, and most disturbing of all, began to develop preferences about the taste and texture of human flesh. James Fletcher's murder in the spring of 1890 showed clear signs of premeditation. Mortimer had encountered Fletcher at the Thornwick Inn, where the unemployed weaver was seeking information about work opportunities in the area. Rather than leave their meeting to chance, Mortimer deliberately engaged Fletcher in conversation, eventually offering him temporary employment repairing stone walls on the farm. The journal entry describing Fletcher's death reveals Mortimer's growing confidence in his methods. The mill hand was hungrier than most. Took 3 helpings of stew before the laudanum had him. Stronger than the widow woman. Required more persuasion with the hammer. Better eating, though. Younger meat is always sweeter. This casual reference to cannibalism represents a crucial development in Mortimer's criminal evolution. What had begun as a practical method of body disposal had become, for him, a source of genuine sustenance. Later journal entries contain detailed discussions of preparation methods, cooking times, and even primitive attempts at preservation through smoking and salting. By the autumn of 1890, when Samuel Hartley fell victim to Mortimer's predations, the killer had refined his operation to a disturbing level of efficiency. Hartley, the traveling peddler, had been specifically targeted for the money he was known to carry. Mortimer had tracked the man's route for weeks, learning his habits and identifying the optimal location for an approach. The murder followed Mortimer's established pattern, but with refinements that spoke to his growing expertise. He had prepared the cellar in advance, laying out his tools with surgical precision. The journal entry describing Hartley's death is notable for its complete lack of emotion. The fat peddler carried 43 pounds, 2 shillings, and 6 pence. His pack held good quality knives and some silver-plated items that will sell well. He provided nearly 1.5 stones of usable meat. The pigs consumed the remainder in 2 days. This cold accounting of human life in terms of monetary and nutritional value reveals the complete dehumanization that had overtaken Mortimer's thinking. His victims were no longer people with hopes, fears, and loved ones who would mourn their passing. They were simply resources to be harvested, no different from the livestock he had once raised for market. The journal entries from 1891 and early 1892 document an alarming escalation in both frequency and brutality. Where his early murders had been opportunistic encounters with individuals who happened to cross his path, Mortimer began actively hunting for victims. He would travel to neighboring towns, frequenting inns and lodging houses where displaced workers gathered in search of employment. His respectable appearance and apparent prosperity made him an attractive prospect to desperate job seekers. The murders during this period reveal increasingly sophisticated planning. Mortimer had developed a network of aliases and cover stories, presenting himself as a representative of various fictitious employers seeking workers for remote projects. He would arrange to meet potential victims at predetermined locations, always ensuring that the final approach to his farm occurred under cover of darkness. Perhaps most chilling of all, the journal reveals that Mortimer had begun to develop genuine expertise in butchery and meat preparation. He studied anatomy texts borrowed from the Blackburn Public Library, learning to identify the choicest cuts and most efficient methods of processing. His entries from this period read like grotesque cookbooks, complete with recipes and serving suggestions. The discovery of personal belongings throughout the farm property provided physical evidence to corroborate the journal's horrific accounts. Margaret Ashworth's wedding ring, found buried beneath the pig-feeding trough, bore the inscription, "To my beloved Sarah," on the inner band. Investigators had initially misidentified it until parish records revealed that Margaret's middle name was Sarah. James Fletcher's identification papers, water-stained and partially decomposed, were hidden in a tin box beneath Mortimer's bed. Samuel Hartley's peddler's license, issued by the borough of Preston, was discovered wrapped in oiled cloth inside the root cellar, but it was the discovery of human remains in the pig enclosures that provided the most damning evidence of Mortimer's crimes. Forensic analysis, primitive by modern standards but revolutionary for its time, revealed bone fragments from at least 7 different individuals. Cut marks on the bones were consistent with the butchering tools found in Mortimer's possession, and the scatter pattern suggested systematic feeding to the pigs over an extended period. The pigs themselves had become unwitting accomplices in Mortimer's crimes. Well-fed and healthy, they had grown to enormous size on their grisly diet. When investigators eventually had the animals slaughtered for evidence, Stomach contents revealed partially digested human tissue, bone fragments, and even recognizable personal items such as buttons and jewelry that the victims had worn. By the time of his final murder in October 1892, Mortimer had become a predator of terrifying efficiency. His journal entries from this period reveal a man who felt complete confidence in his ability to kill and dispose of victims without detection. He had even begun to consider expanding his operation, making notes about the possibility of acquiring additional property or recruiting accomplices who could help him process larger numbers of victims. What Mortimer could not have anticipated was that his own success would ultimately lead to his downfall. The sheer volume of human remains scattered about his property, the increasingly powerful odors emanating from his pig enclosures, and his own growing carelessness in disposing of evidence would soon attract the attention that had eluded him for nearly 3 years. The journal's final entry, dated November 12, 1892, just 3 days before Constable Whitfield's horrific discovery, reveals a man still confident in his invulnerability. The pigs grow fat and profitable. No one comes calling. The work continues. God provides and I harvest his bounty. Within 72 hours of writing those words, Caleb Mortimer would be a fugitive, his terrible secret exposed, and his name destined to become synonymous with the very depths of human depravity. But for now, investigators face the grim task of identifying his victims and determining the full scope of crimes that had unfolded in the shadow of the Lancashire moors. Detective Inspector Harold Morrison arrived at Mortimer's farm on the afternoon of November 16, 1892, accompanied by 2 constables from the Manchester Division and Dr. Edmund Hartwell, one of the few physicians in northern England with experience in forensic medicine. Morrison was a methodical man of 47 years, his graying beard and wire-rimmed spectacles giving him the appearance of a university professor rather than a police detective. But his 23 years of service, including several high-profile murder investigations in Manchester's industrial districts, had prepared him for scenes of considerable brutality. Nothing, however, had prepared him for what awaited at the Mortimer farm. Morrison's first task was to secure the crime scene, a concept still novel in rural policing of the 1890s. He ordered the property cordoned off with rope, posted guards at all entrances, and established a systematic approach to cataloging evidence, methods he had learned during a brief exchange program with German police investigators 2 years earlier. His meticulous attention to detail would prove crucial in building the case against Mortimer. Dr. Hartwell's initial examination of the human remains scattered throughout the pig enclosures confirmed Constable Whitfield's worst fears. Using a magnifying glass and crude measuring instruments, Hartwell was able to identify bone fragments from at least 7 different individuals, ranging in age from approximately 25 to 50 years. More disturbing still, the systematic nature of the cut marks on the bones suggested that whoever had processed these remains possessed considerable knowledge of anatomy and butchering techniques. These incisions were made by someone with surgical precision, Hartwell reported to Morrison on the evening of November 17th. The killer understood how to separate joints efficiently, how to remove flesh from bone with minimal waste. This is not the work of a madman acting in passion, Inspector. This is the work of someone who approached murder as a craft. While Dr. Hartwell continued his grisly examination of the physical remains, Morrison focused on reconstructing Mortimer's movements in the days leading up to the discovery. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, the village postmistress and mother of Mortimer's former wife, Sarah. Despite her daughter's traumatic experience with Mortimer, Mrs. Whitmore had maintained a cautious correspondence with him over the years, primarily concerning mail delivery to his isolated farm. He came to the post office on the evening of November 12th, Mrs. Whitmore told Morrison, her hands trembling as she recalled the encounter. He seemed agitated, kept looking over his shoulder as if someone were following him. He asked about the next mail coach to Liverpool and whether there were any police inquiries about him. I thought it odd at the time, but Caleb had always been peculiar. This information provided Morrison with a crucial timeline. Mortimer had become aware that discovery was imminent, possibly through observing increased activity by neighboring farmers or sensing that his carefully constructed isolation was beginning to crack. The fact that he had inquired about transportation to Liverpool suggested an escape plan involving sea passage, probably to America, or one of the colonies where a man with sufficient funds could disappear entirely. Morrison immediately telegraphed the Liverpool Constabulary with Mortimer's description and likely destination. But tracking a fugitive across the industrial sprawl of England's second-largest port city would require more than police circulars. It would require understanding how a man like Mortimer would think and behave when cornered. The investigation of Mortimer's farmhouse revealed the methodical planning that had enabled his crimes to continue undetected for nearly 3 years. Hidden compartments throughout the building contained not only his encrypted journal, but also detailed maps of the surrounding countryside marked with locations where he had encountered potential victims. A leather-bound ledger documented the sale of victims' personal belongings to second-hand dealers in distant towns, showing that Mortimer had generated considerable profit from his murderous enterprise. Most revealing of all was the discovery of multiple sets of identification papers, some clearly belonging to his victims and others bearing Mortimer's photograph but different names. These false documents suggested that his escape plan had been months or even years in the making, and that he possessed resources and connections that extended far beyond his isolated farm. The cipher key that unlocked Mortimer's journal was discovered purely by accident when Constable Williams, the youngest member of Morrison's team, noticed that certain letters in the journal corresponded to markings carved into the wooden beam above Mortimer's bed. The beam bore what appeared to be decorative notches, but when aligned with the journal's coded text, they revealed a simple substitution cipher that transformed the cryptic symbols into readable English. As news of the discoveries at Mortimer's farm spread throughout Lancashire and beyond, Morrison found himself coordinating an investigation that had captured national attention. Reporters from London newspapers arrived in Thornwick, transforming the quiet village into a temporary circus of journalists, photographers, and curiosity seekers. The Manchester Guardian dubbed Mortimer the pig farm butcher, a moniker that would follow him into infamy. Public interest in the case generated both valuable leads and considerable interference with the investigation. Farmers throughout northern England reported suspicious activities at neighboring properties, most of which proved to be nothing more than rural eccentricity, magnified by fear and imagination. But several reports provided genuine insights into Mortimer's movements during his years of killing. Thomas Brennan, a cattle dealer from Burnley, recalled encountering Mortimer at livestock markets in 3 different towns during 1891. He never bought anything, never sold anything, Brennan told Morrison. Just watched and listened like he was studying the people more than the animals. This made my skin crawl, if I'm honest. Something is not right about a man who goes to market but never does business. These sightings helped Morrison piece together the systematic way Mortimer had selected his hunting grounds, always choosing locations far enough from his farm to avoid creating patterns that might attract attention, but close enough to allow him to transport victims without excessive risk. The breakthrough in locating Mortimer came on November 23rd, when Liverpool Police Constable Patrick O'Malley recognized the fugitive at a boarding house near the Albert Dock. Mortimer had been using the name Charles Morton and claimed to be a livestock dealer seeking passage to New York. His appearance had changed dramatically. In the week since his flight, he had shaved his distinctive beard and lost considerable weight, giving him a gaunt, almost skeletal appearance that made him seem far older than his 47 years. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, O'Malley later testified. His clothes were expensive enough, but they hung on him like sacks. And his eyes. Lord preserve us, his eyes were like those of a cornered animal, wild and desperate, but cunning too. Mortimer's arrest was accomplished without violence, though he made one desperate attempt to escape by throwing himself through a second-story window. The fall left him with a broken arm and severe bruising, but he remained conscious and coherent. His first words to O'Malley were not a denial of guilt or a request for legal representation, but a question that chilled everyone who heard it. "What did you do with my pigs?" The journey back to Lancashire provided Morrison with his first opportunity to interrogate Mortimer directly. Despite his physical injuries and obvious exhaustion, the prisoner proved to be an intelligent and articulate man who seemed almost relieved to finally discuss his crimes with someone who could appreciate their complexity. "You wouldn't understand," Mortimer told Morrison as their train rattled through the Pennine countryside. "Living alone like that, watching the world change, watching decent people turned into beggars and thieves by forces beyond their control. I was providing a service, Inspector. taking the surplus population and putting it to good use. Efficiency, you might call it. Morrison's careful questioning revealed a man who had constructed an elaborate philosophical justification for his actions. In Mortimer's twisted worldview, his victims were already casualties of industrial progress, displaced souls who would likely have died of poverty or disease within months of their disappearance. By killing them quickly and putting their remains to practical use, he believed he was actually performing an act of mercy, while simultaneously solving the problem of rural food shortage. The pigs grew fat and healthy, Mortimer explained with the pride of a successful businessman. I sold that meat to butchers in 3 counties, fed dozens of families with protein they could never have afforded otherwise. Tell me, Inspector, how many people do you suppose I actually saved from hunger? The moral bankruptcy of these statements was obvious to Morrison, but they provided crucial insight into how Mortimer had been able to continue his crimes for so long without apparent guilt or remorse. He had convinced himself that mass murder was actually a form of social service, a delusion that had allowed him to sleep peacefully while his victims' bones littered his pig enclosures. The train carrying Mortimer back to face justice arrived in Manchester on November 24, 1892. To crowds of spectators who had gathered to catch a glimpse of the man whose crimes had horrified the nation, police cordons were necessary to prevent mob violence as shouts of "murderer" and "cannibal" echoed through the station. Mortimer observed the chaos with apparent interest rather than fear, at one point remarking to Morrison that he had never seen so many people gathered in one place. As Mortimer was processed into custody at Manchester's Strangeways prison, Morrison reflected on the investigation that had consumed 2 weeks of intensive work and revealed crimes that challenged the very foundations of civilized society. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The documentary evidence was comprehensive, and the suspect had effectively confessed to multiple murders. But questions remained that might never be fully answered. How many victims had Mortimer actually claimed during his 3 years of systematic killing? The bone fragments suggested at least 7, but his journal contained references to encounters that might have ended in murder, and there were gaps in his records that could represent additional crimes. The cipher had been broken, but portions of the journal remained illegible due to water damage and deliberate obliteration. More troubling still was the question of whether Mortimer had acted entirely alone. His false identification papers and knowledge of criminal networks suggested connections that extended beyond the isolated world of his moorland farm. During the investigation, Morrison had uncovered evidence of at least 2 other individuals who had visited the farm during the period when the murders were taking place, though their identities and potential involvement remained mysteries. As Mortimer awaited trial in his Strangeways cell, writing what he claimed would be a full confession, but which turned out to be a rambling philosophical treatise on social improvement through selective elimination, Morrison began preparing the case that would bring one of Britain's most notorious killers to justice. The evidence was comprehensive, the public demand for swift justice was overwhelming, and the legal system would soon render its verdict on crimes that had shocked even hardened investigators. But the true measure of Mortimer's legacy would not be found in courtroom proceedings or newspaper headlines. It would be found in the families who would never know what had become of their missing loved ones, in the communities that would struggle to trust their neighbors again, and in the questions about human nature that his crimes had raised but could never fully answer. The immediate impact of the Mortimer case extended far beyond the courtroom and the gallows. Public outrage over the systematic nature of his crimes prompted a parliamentary inquiry into rural law enforcement, leading to significant reforms in the deployment of constables to remote areas. The Home Office established new protocols for investigating missing persons cases, particularly those involving transient workers who had previously been dismissed as having simply moved on to seek employment elsewhere. More significantly, the case contributed to the development of criminal psychology as a legitimate field of study. Dr. Wells's testimony about moral insanity sparked intense debate among medical professionals about the relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior. The detailed documentation of Mortimer's crimes, preserved in his encrypted journal, provided researchers with unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer, though that term would not be coined for several more decades. The village of Thornwick struggled to recover from its association with such notorious crimes. Property values plummeted throughout the area, and several farming families abandoned their holdings rather than remain in a community forever linked to cannibalistic murder. The Mortimer farm itself stood empty for nearly 5 years before being purchased by a Manchester businessman who demolished all the structures and converted the land to sheep grazing. Perhaps most tragically, the true extent of Mortimer's crimes remained unknown. Despite intensive investigation, authorities could never definitively determine how many victims he had claimed during his 3 years of systematic killing. The 7 confirmed murders represented only those cases where sufficient physical evidence remained for positive identification. Gaps in Mortimer's journal suggested additional victims, and reports of missing persons from surrounding counties during the same period hinted at crimes that might never be solved. The families of identified victims struggled with grief, complicated by the horrific circumstances of their loved ones' deaths. Margaret Ashworth's sister, Elizabeth, spent years campaigning for financial compensation from the government, arguing that the state's failure to protect transient workers had enabled Mortimer's crimes. James Fletcher's aging parents never fully recovered from learning the fate of their son, and Samuel Hartley's widow was institutionalized after suffering a complete mental breakdown upon hearing the details of her husband's murder. The case also revealed disturbing truths about Victorian society's treatment of its most vulnerable members. The ease with which Mortimer had been able to prey upon displaced workers highlighted the systematic neglect of those caught between industrial progress and agricultural decline. Social reformers seized upon the case as evidence of the need for better support systems for the unemployed and displaced, leading to modest improvements in workhouse conditions and the establishment of employment bureaus in several major cities. In the decades that followed, the Mortimer case became a touchstone for discussions about the nature of evil and the limits of human depravity. Criminologists studying the emerging phenomenon of serial killing invariably referenced his methodical approach and psychological detachment. Literary figures found inspiration in his story, producing novels and penny dreadfuls that often sensationalized the crimes while missing their deeper social implications. Modern psychological analysis of Mortimer's documented behavior suggests he would likely be diagnosed today as a psychopath with narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders. His ability to function normally in social situations while harboring such violent fantasies, combined with his complete lack of empathy for his victims, fits patterns that researchers have identified in numerous serial killers throughout history. The agricultural techniques that enabled Mortimer's crimes, the use of pigs for body disposal, would unfortunately be replicated by other killers in subsequent decades. Law enforcement agencies eventually developed protocols for investigating suspicious pig farming operations, and agricultural inspectors were trained to recognize signs of potentially criminal activity on isolated farms. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Caleb Mortimer case lies not in its contribution to criminal justice or psychological research, but in the questions it raised about the thin veneer of civilization that separates ordered society from barbarism. How many other Mortimers, investigators wondered, might be lurking in the remote corners of the empire, preying upon society's forgotten members while maintaining facades of respectability? The answer, history would reveal, was more disturbing than anyone in 1893 could have imagined. The systematic murder of vulnerable populations, the reduction of human beings to commodities, the transformation of killing into an industrial process. These would become hallmarks not just of individual psychopaths, but of entire political systems in the century that followed. In this context, Caleb Mortimer emerges not merely as a uniquely twisted individual, but as a harbinger of horrors to come. His belief that certain people were surplus to society's needs, his conviction that efficiency justified any means, his reduction of human worth to utilitarian calculations, all of these would find expression on scales that dwarfed even his systematic cruelty. Today, more than a century after his execution, the name Caleb Mortimer continues to evoke revulsion and fascination in equal measure. His crimes remind us that the capacity for ultimate evil exists not in monsters who are obviously different from ourselves, but in individuals who can appear entirely normal while harboring the most violent and predatory impulses. The pig farm in Lancashire has long since returned to productive agricultural use, its dark history known only to local historians, and the occasional true crime enthusiast who makes the pilgrimage to see where such horrors once unfolded. But the questions raised by Mortimer's 3 years of systematic murder questions about human nature, social responsibility, and the price of progress remain as relevant and troubling today as they were in the gaslit courtrooms of Victorian England. In the end, perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Caleb Mortimer case is not the graphic details of his crimes, but the uncomfortable recognition that the social conditions which enabled them, poverty, displacement, the dehumanization of society's most vulnerable members,